The Apache girl collapsed in his arms at sunset, her breath thin as paper, her skin burning with fear he did not yet understand. He carried her across the ravine and through rising wind, knowing only that someone had chased her hard enough to break her strength. All night he tended her by the fire, waiting for her eyes to open, praying the danger would not find them. But at first light, the ground trembled. From the ridge came 300 riders, silent and grim, their spears catching the morning sun. And every one of them was staring at his cabin. The girl weighed almost nothing in his arms, yet the burden of carrying her felt heavier than any pack he had slung across his shoulders in years. Her breath fluttered against his chest, shallow and uncertain, as if her strength had been scattered across the desert behind them. The night air clung to her skin with a cold that no blanket could fully chase away. He moved through the darkness with careful steps, feeling the uneven ground shift beneath his boots while the wind whispered through the sagebrush. The cabin waited ahead, a single dark shape against the faint starlight, offering what little shelter a lonely man could give. Inside, he laid her in the quiet corner near the hearth. Firelight rose slowly as he worked to coax the flames higher, casting long, trembling shadows across the wooden floor. Her face glowed faintly in that warm light, revealing dust smeared across her cheekbones and a bruise darkening near her temple. She stirred once, but her eyes did not open. Whatever had chased her had taken more than breath. It had taken the certainty from her limbs and the steadiness from her heart. He sat beside the dying fire and listened to the silence beyond the walls. Not a single hoofbeat, not a single echo of the danger she had fled. Only the wind shifting through the cottonwoods and the distant cry of a night bird too far away to matter. For a moment, he let himself believe the danger would not follow her across this lonely stretch of land. For a moment, he believed she might sleep through to safety. But dawn rose like the blade of a slow-turning knife. Pale light crept across the floorboards and reached for the rough curve of his boot. He woke with a stiffness in his back and a heaviness in his chest that told him he was no longer alone in the valley. Something pressed against the air outside, something heavier than the morning cold. He stepped to the window and pushed aside the cloth that served as a curtain. The sight struck him with a force that emptied every quiet thought from his mind. The ridge above the cabin was lined with riders, hundreds of them. Shapes of horses and warriors stretched across the skyline in disciplined stillness. Spears caught the rising sun. Feathers trembled in the Shirley breeze. Their presence was not wild or reckless. It was solemn, intentional, a judgment waiting to be passed. His breath thinned in his chest. He knew at once this was no search party. This was a reckoning. The girl behind him was the center of it, though she lay silent and unaware. Her fate had crossed the threshold of his cabin during the night, and with it came the knowledge that whatever storm hunted her had now turned its gaze upon him as well. The morning light brightened until the riders seemed carved from fire and earth. No movement, no sound. Only the weight of 300 warriors staring down at a solitary cabin and the lone man who had brought their fugitive inside. The riders did not shift or murmur or lean forward in restless anticipation. They stood in a long, unbroken line across the ridge, their silhouettes sharpened by the growing light. The cowboy watched them from the narrow window, one hand resting against the frame, as if steadying himself against the weight of what he saw. Their horses held firm and quiet, heads lifted, breath rising in pale morning clouds. Spears pointed toward the sky rather than toward the valley below. Nothing in their posture hinted at impatience or fury. Instead, there was the solemn stillness of a gathering meant to witness judgment. He felt the air tighten around him with a pressure that lived somewhere between reverence and threat. These warriors had not arrived in disorder. They had not stormed down the ridge in a wave of wrath or vengeance. They had arranged themselves with the precision of a ritual. Whatever fate awaited the girl did not belong to the chaos of bloodshed. It belonged to something older and heavier than that, something that carried the weight of tradition and consequence. Behind him, the cabin remained dim, except for the trembling glow of the fire pit. A single ember clung to life in the center of the ashes, its color a soft and stubborn red. It pulsed faintly, refusing to fade, even as the rest of the fire had collapsed into gray dust. His gaze lingered on it for a long moment. In that fragile ember, he saw a reflection of the uncertain hope that had brought the girl this far. She had not fallen entirely into darkness. Not yet. Something inside her had insisted on surviving long enough to reach his door. A soft sound broke the silence. Her breath hitched, and a tremor passed across her body. He turned toward her and saw her eyelids flicker against the light. Her fingers curled weakly around the edge of the blanket. A memory rose in her mind with the suddenness of a blow. Fire crackled somewhere behind her eyes. She felt the sting of smoke along her throat. Feet thundered around her, the ground shaking with the frantic movement of running bodies. She heard someone call her name in a voice torn between fear and pleading. Then the memory slipped away, leaving her chest rising in quick, shallow breaths, as if she were still trying to outrun whatever chased her through that fading vision. He knelt beside her, not touching her, only watching the struggle in her face. She did not yet understand where she had collapsed or who had lifted her from the desert floor. She was caught between the world behind her and the one waiting outside his cabin. The distance between those two worlds felt impossibly thin. He looked once more to the ridge. 300 riders waited without a single break in their formation. They had come for a reason. They had come for her. If he opened his door now and stepped aside, they would take her in silence and carry her back to whatever judgment they believed she deserved. If he refused, he would stand alone, against a tide no man could hope to stop. His gaze drifted back to the ember. It pulsed again, a tiny heartbeat of warmth inside a pit of a cold ash. He felt the weight of his choice settle across his shoulders. Return her or protect her. One path offered safety for himself. The other demanded he risk everything for a stranger whose past could destroy them both. The wind rose as the sun cleared the ridge, brushing against the cabin walls with a dry scraping sound that felt too familiar. It carried grains of sand that tapped against the window frame like restless fingers. The cowboy stood in that thin light and let the sound pull him backward into a part of his life he seldom allowed himself to revisit. The desert outside moved with the same harsh breath that had followed him across countless miles, a constant reminder of wounds he had never allowed to fully close. Years ago, he had ridden under the command of men who believed the frontier could be shaped by force alone. He had served as a scout, moving between lands claimed by settlers and those held sacred by Apache families. In those days, he believed he could balance loyalty with fairness. He tried to speak truth to both sides. He tried to guide patrols away from villages and guide frightened families away from patrols. He once believed the land itself would reward those who sought peace. Then came the night that turned him harsh inside. A group of settlers had been attacked near the foothills. The survivors wanted swift justice. They claimed they had seen Apache warriors fleeing into the darkness. The cowboy knew the claim did not match the tracks he found in the dust. The tracks belonged to a band of outlaws who had been raiding under false colors for months. He brought this truth to his commander, believing the man would listen. Instead, he found himself accused of loyalty to the Apache and blamed for misleading the search party. The commander ordered a punishment patrol. It was meant to be a simple show of force. Instead, it ended in a village set aflame and an elder killed while trying to shield a child. The cowboy remembered the moment the flames rose against the night sky, staining the clouds with red that looked like torn cloth drifting across the stars. He remembered the cries of the families who had lost everything. Most of all, he remembered the stillness of the elder who had reached out a hand in the final moment, not in anger, but in a quiet plea for understanding that came too late. The commander blamed the cowboy for the tragedy and sent word that he was to be relieved of duty. The cowboy left before they could force him out. He walked away from the militia, from the settlements, from the roads that carried whispers of the elder who had died beneath a false judgment. He carved his cabin into the valley and let the wind take the rest of his hope. Now that same wind scraped at the walls, like an old memory sharpening its edge. The girl slept behind him, caught between life and whatever remnants of terror still haunted her dreams. He could not hand her over without knowing what truth clung to her story. He had witnessed what a false accusation could become when left unchecked. He had carried the weight of another innocent life lost to the blade of fear and anger. The riders on the ridge waited for him to surrender her, but the scars he carried refused to let him repeat the sins he once witnessed without raising a hand to stop it. Her breath snagged in her throat as she drifted back into awareness. A tremor passed through her limbs, faint at first, and then sharp enough to pull her halfway upright. Fear struck her before memory did. Her eyes darted to the corners of the cabin as if expecting the night to fall upon her again. She pushed herself toward the edge of the blanket, but her arms folded beneath her weight. She collapsed onto the floorboards with a soft thud, her breath escaping in a thin rush. The cowboy crossed the room in 2 strides and slid an arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her with slow patience, as if he feared his strength might worsen her fragile state. Her skin burned with a fever that had settled deep from exhaustion and fear. Dirt streaked down her arms in irregular lines, broken by patches of dried blood. As he loosened the torn fabric near her shoulder, he paused. A set of intricate markings circled her upper arm, carved in dark ink with delicate symmetry. They were not common adornments. They were signs of lineage, the kind worn by those who carried responsibilities far heavier than their years. He had seen these symbols only a few times in his past, during meetings arranged to avoid violence rather than invite it. The realization tightened something in his chest. This girl was not a wandering traveler who had stumbled into misfortune. She belonged to a family whose decisions could sway entire bands of people. Outside, the steady rhythm of hooves began to shift. The riders who had remained still through the morning now moved with purpose. Horses stepped forward. Warriors dismounted in near-perfect unison. Dust rose in a muted cloud behind them. Their formation widened into a circle that wrapped around the cabin like a closing hand. The tension in the valley thickened. A figure near the front planted a tall staff into the ground. At its peak hung a cloth of deep red that swayed in the rising wind. The cowboy recognized the gesture. This was no call to battle. This was a summons, a demand to reveal someone of great importance. The girl lifted her head at the movement outside. Though her body shook, her eyes sharpened with sudden clarity. She turned toward the window, and the instant she saw the flag, her breath stopped. A flicker of memory tore through her. The symbol was clear to her, even through the morning glare. It carried the crest of her own people and the authority of a leader who ruled through strength and ceremony. Her reaction was instinctive and filled with dread. Her hand rose toward her shoulder, as if trying to shield the markings that declared her identity. She pressed her forehead against the cowboy's arm, as though the nearness of another living presence steadied her for a heartbeat. In the trembling wideness of her eyes, the cowboy read a truth that chilled him deeper than the morning wind. She knew exactly who waited outside, and she knew exactly why they had come. The fear that consumed her was not born from the danger of strangers. It was born from those who should have been her protectors. The cowboy stepped into the open with his hands lifted just enough to show they held nothing. The wind brushed against his coat and carried the scent of dust and horses. The circle of riders watched him with unwavering focus. Not a stir, not a whisper, only the sound of the valley breathing around them. The stillness pressed on him like a weight placed upon his chest, heavy and expectant. He walked a few paces from the cabin door and stopped where the light touched his boots. Behind him, the girl lay hidden from their view, her fate resting in whatever words came next. From the line of riders, an elder stepped forward. His pace was measured, and his presence struck with the authority of someone who had weathered many seasons of conflict and consequence. He wore his age with a quiet strength. The lines on his face carried stories of both hardship and tradition. He stopped a short distance from the cowboy and lifted his gaze to meet him. The air tightened between them as if the valley itself held its breath. The elder spoke with a voice shaped by years of leadership. He declared that the girl had betrayed her people. He claimed she guided enemies toward a hidden camp, leaving families vulnerable and unprepared. His words carried the gravity of an accusation that could not be taken lightly. The riders behind him stood rigid, their formation echoing the belief that justice must be served without hesitation. Yet the cowboy felt something in the elder's tone that did not match the harshness of the claim. Beneath the firm deliverance lay a layer of sorrow that softened the edges of his accusation. The cowboy studied the elder closely. His eyes held grief rather than anger. His shoulders carried a heaviness that came from doubt rather than certainty. It was the look of a man forced to speak a judgment he did not fully accept. It stirred something deep within the cowboy, a memory of another time when truth had been twisted and an innocent life had been lost to fear. He let the elder's words settle in the quiet. The wind drifted across the ridge, lifting the feathered adornments on the riders and sending scattered grains of sand toward the cabin. The cowboy felt the eyes of every warrior upon him, waiting for him to admit he had sheltered someone who had committed a grave offense. Yet the silence between him and the elder told another story. Something did not fit. The accusation felt shaped by another hand, the fear in the girl's eyes, the ceremonial flag raised with too much urgency, the markings on her arm that signified her importance. He stood rooted to the ground, the weight of his decision deepening. To believe the riders meant surrendering her to a judgment that might already be decided. To trust his instinct meant defying a force far greater than himself. The valley seemed to lean closer, as if listening for the choice he would make. His breath steadied as he realized the truth. This moment would decide not only the girl's future, but the kind of man he refused to stop being. The memory rose inside her like smoke rising from a dying fire. It curled through the edges of her mind, hazy at first, then sharp enough to make her chest tighten. She lay inside the cabin, her eyes half open, and the world around her faded until only the flames of the past remained. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the walls, but she did not hear the present. She was pulled back into the night that had torn her life apart. She remembered the camp lit by torches, their glow flickering against the trunks of tall pines. Warriors gathered in a ring, faces set in grim anticipation. She had been sent to carry water for the families preparing for the journey at first light. She had thought it was just another night. But as she moved between the fires, she saw the war captain speaking in low tones to a band of restless young fighters. His voice carried the edge of a man who fed on conflict. He stirred pride and fear together, like a pot meant to boil over. She stepped closer, unnoticed at first, until she caught a single phrase that chilled her. The war captain claimed that enemies had been spotted near their lands. He used that claim to ignite anger in those gathered around him. Yet she knew the truth. Those enemies were shadows created by the captain himself. He wanted a confrontation that would raise his standing among the warriors. If blood spilled, he would claim victory through the sacrifice of others. If defeat followed, he would place the blame on anyone who opposed him. She stepped forward and challenged him. The memory sharpened, showing her own voice trembling but firm. She warned the others that the danger had been exaggerated, that the captain sought power without regard for the cost. Her words cut through the murmurs of the crowd. For a brief moment she felt hope that reason might be stronger than fear. But the captain turned his gaze on her, and in that gaze she saw his plan shift. He accused her of spreading lies. He claimed she had been seen carrying messages to outsiders. He spun his accusation with skill, turning her attempt to protect the camp into a charge of betrayal. Confusion rippled through the warriors. Some looked uncertain. Others believed him at once. The flashback darkened. She saw the moment the first blow struck, not at her, but at the innocent families caught in the chaos that erupted when the captain ordered his men to act. A clash tore through the camp. Fire spilled across the ground as a torch struck a rope binding a shelter. The rope ignited, flames crawling along its length. She watched it burn, the fibers glowing orange, before snapping apart with a bright crack that echoed through her memory. In that snapping rope, she felt something inside her break free. She fled through the smoke, knowing that if she stayed, the captain would twist the truth until every loss became her fault. His ambition had already claimed lives. She would not let him claim hers. The memory faded, leaving her trembling in the dim cabin while the echo of that burning rope lingered like a warning she could never forget. The cowboy stood at the edge of the circling riders as the elder stepped away from the line. The warriors watched in silence while the two men walked toward a cluster of stones where the wind carried less dust. The elder kept his gaze fixed on the valley floor, as if the weight of the mountain behind him pressed down on his spine. When they stopped, the cowboy let the quiet stretch until the elder finally looked up. The morning light revealed the strain around the older man's eyes, a strain that deepened each time he glanced toward the cabin. The cowboy spoke first, his voice low and steady. He described the markings on the girl's arm. He recounted the way she had collapsed in fear rather than aggression. He noted that the ceremonial flag had been raised with unnatural haste, as though someone wanted the judgment delivered before any question could be asked. He spoke of the grief in the elder's voice rather than the certainty of a leader delivering justice. Each detail rested between them, like stones placed on a scale that refused to settle. The elder closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, the facade he had worn before the riders was cracked. His shoulders, once held with the rigid posture of authority, sagged with unspoken burden. He admitted that he had long sensed ambition growing wild in the war captain. He had seen how the captain fed unrest among the young warriors. He confessed that he feared the captain sought to ignite conflict that would elevate his own standing. But suspicion was not proof, and proof was required to challenge a man who commanded the loyalty of many. The elder turned his face toward the assembled warriors, their horses restless beneath the rising wind. He said that to question the war, Captain openly would fracture the unity of the band. It could split families. It could draw them into bloodshed among their own people. His voice trembled with that truth. He did not fear the loss of his own standing. He feared the shattering of the community he had spent his life protecting. The cowboy listened in silence. His jaw tightened as the elder's fears echoed the memories that still haunted him. He understood the weight of a decision that could tear a people apart. He also understood the cost of allowing a lie to stand unchallenged. The valley wind pushed against his coat, scraping the air with a harshness that matched the tension inside him. He looked toward his cabin, where the girl lay hidden and fragile. He imagined handing her over, imagined watching the riders carry her toward a fate shaped by another man's ambition. He imagined hiding her, knowing the warriors would search every shadow until they found her. And he imagined standing against all of them, with only his conviction to shield him. The choice felt like a narrow path carved through stone, each direction carrying its own ruin. The cowboy steadied his breath as the elder waited, caught between his duty and his doubt. The valley held still around them, preparing for the moment when thought would turn into action and silence into consequence. The war captain rode forward with the force of a storm gathering strength. His horse stamped the dry earth, sending dust swirling around his boots. He lifted his voice so that every warrior and every breath of wind could hear him. He demanded the return of the girl. He claimed her guilt was beyond question. He declared that if she remained inside the cabin any longer, the cabin itself would be taken as sheltering a traitor. Fire would cleanse what defiance had stained. His words carried the sharpness of a man who had already decided the fate he wished to see carried out. The cowboy felt the ground shift beneath him, as though the valley braced for the violence those words invited. He saw the flicker of eagerness in some of the younger warriors. He saw the hesitation in others. The elder stood further back, silent and tense, his hands folded with the weight of worry. The cowboy lifted his chin and met the war captain's stare. He did not answer. Silence settled between them, a stubborn refusal to surrender to intimidation. The wind tightened around them, as if the valley itself waited for the next breath to decide the shape of the day. He stepped backward toward the cabin door. Each step felt heavier, as though the path behind him grew shorter with every moment. Inside the dim cabin, shadows clung to the corners. The girl lay slumped against the wall, her breath steadying but still thin. She struggled to sit upright, bracing her trembling arms on the wooden floor. Her eyes searched his face, reading the tension held in his shoulders and the quiet resolve behind his gaze. She understood the threat outside, even without hearing every word. The cowboy moved to the corner where his old rifle rested. He lifted it with careful hands. The metal felt cool and familiar against his palm. It had not been fired in many seasons. Dust coated the stock. Scratches along its length carried memories of nights when he had believed he could protect the innocent and failed. He did not lift it as a weapon. He lifted it as a reminder of a life lost because he had not stood firm when truth needed a defender. The weight of that moment pressed into his grip, shaping the steadiness in his breath. The girl drew in a shallow breath and tried to speak. Her voice cracked, no louder than the rustle of dry leaves. She forced out a few strained words. They were not yet full sentences, but they carried the strength of someone who wished to claim her own fate. She touched her shoulder, where the markings rested, her fingers tracing them with a blend of fear and pride. The cowboy knelt beside her, listening not only to the sound of her voice, but to the courage that pulled each word into the open. Outside, the war captain lifted a torch. Flames licked the air, bright and hungry. The riders shifted in anticipation. But inside the cabin, a different fire stirred. A fire not born of destruction, but of resolve, rising in two souls who refused to bow to a lie. The cabin door opened with a slow creak as the cowboy stepped into the light with the girl leaning against him. Her legs wavered beneath her, but she forced herself forward. Each step carried the weight of her past and the uncertainty of what waited before her. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and the dust of the valley rose around them in a soft, unsettled cloud. 300 riders watched in complete silence. Their formation did not break. Their eyes followed her every movement, as though her presence alone might tip the balance between truth and destruction. She stopped a few paces from the cowboy and steadied herself with one hand pressed against his arm. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. For a moment, it seemed she might collapse again. But she lifted her head and looked at the sea of riders with a steadiness that surprised even her. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. The first words came raw and thin. She forced herself to continue. She told them of the night in the camp. She described the war captain gathering the restless young warriors. She recounted how he twisted suspicion into certainty and fanned fear into fury. She told them of the ambush he allowed to rise unchecked so that he might claim victory, or shift blame as needed. Her voice wavered, but the truth held firm in every word. She lifted her hand to her shoulder and revealed the markings of her lineage. The warriors murmured, their attention shifting from uncertainty to concern. She told them she had tried to stop the violence. She told them she had been accused without reason. She told them she fled because she saw that the captain would sacrifice her to strengthen his own standing. The elder stepped forward. His face carried the weight of years spent guiding his people. He turned to the war captain and raised his voice in front of the entire assembly. He asked why the captain had failed to report the ambush with clarity. He asked why the fires had risen too quickly for a simple misunderstanding. He asked why the young warriors near the captain had been prepared for conflict even before the alarm spread. Each question cut into the silence like a blade pressed against the truth. The war captain barked back with fierce denial. He accused the girl of lies. He pointed to the cabin and called it a refuge for treachery. But the riders did not respond with the certainty he expected. Tension rippled through the line as several warriors exchanged uneasy glances. One of the older fighters stepped from his horse and spoke with quiet weight. He had seen the captain gathering men long before any alarm had been raised. Another admitted hearing whispers of a plan meant to ignite conflict for the sake of honor that had not been earned. The war captain stilled. His authority crumbled as the truth rose around him. The elder turned to the riders and declared that the captain would no longer hold his position. The warriors accepted the judgment with solemn nods. The fire in their eyes faded into respect for the girl who stood trembling yet unbroken. The fury that had once surrounded the cabin gave way to a heavy silence shaped by recognition and regret. The sun climbed higher as the storm of accusation settled into a heavy calm. The riders shifted their formation, not in hostility, but in measured respect. The elder stepped toward the cowboy with a softened gaze. His voice carried the weight of tradition, shaped by gratitude rather than command. He acknowledged the risk the cowboy had taken. He noted that the choice to shelter the girl could have cost him his life. The older warriors bowed their heads in acceptance of this truth, and the younger ones followed with a quiet ripple of humility that moved across the line like wind across tall grass. Several riders approached and placed small tokens at the cowboy's feet, a feather touched by ceremonial paint, a stone carved with the symbol of unity, a narrow strip of woven cloth meant to bless a safe path. These gestures required no spoken promise. They carried centuries of meaning. They offered protection for his future travels and open friendship should he ever cross their lands. The cowboy accepted each token with a calm nod, his hands steady, though a faint ache stirred beneath his ribs. He had not expected honor. He had only kept faith with his own conscience. The girl stood a short distance away, surrounded by warriors who had once arrived with fire in their eyes, but now held their palm against their chest in recognition of her courage. She looked toward the cowboy with an expression that blended gratitude and sorrow. Her strength had returned enough for her to stand without support, but her voice remained quiet with the weight of everything she had endured. She touched the marking on her arm, reclaiming the identity that had almost been turned against her. As her people prepared to guide her home, she walked toward the cowboy. She did not speak. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart, then extended it towards him, in a gesture of trust that belonged to her lineage. He answered with a small incline of his head. It was enough. Their connection did not need words. She turned and stepped back into the circle of riders, who closed around her, not as captors, but as guardians, ready to mend what had been broken. The cowboy watched them begin their slow descent through the valley. Dust rose behind their horses in soft spirals. He felt a quiet ache settle into his chest. He did not know if their paths would ever cross again. The world was wide and the frontier wilder than any prediction a man could make. Yet he felt peace in knowing she no longer walked under the shadow of false judgment. Her future rested in the hands of a people who had finally seen the truth. When the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, he turned back to the cabin. The wind brushed against the walls with a gentler tone than it had that morning. The place that once felt like a refuge, carved from isolation, now felt changed. The wooden boards and dim corners carried the memory of a life saved and a choice made without regret. The cabin no longer seemed like a hiding place. It felt sacred in a quiet, private way. It held the echo of courage and the faint ember of hope that had refused to die. The dusk settled slowly across the valley, turning the air cool and soft as the light dimmed along the distant ridge. The cowboy sat on the rough step outside his cabin and watched the mountains fade into deeper shades of blue. The riders had vanished hours earlier, yet he could still see the faint trail of dust they left behind drifting through his memory like a quiet echo. The silence that followed their departure felt ancient, as if the land itself had paused to honor the weight of the day. He rested his hands on his knees and let the calm settle into his bones. The sky above the mountains shifted through layers of fading color. Pale gold thinned into rose, and rose faded into deep violet. Stars began to gather near the highest peak, like sparks rising from an unseen fire. The cowboy breathed in the cool air and felt a steady ache in his chest. It was not sorrow alone. It was something quieter and more complex. A reminder of the life he had lived before he built the cabin. A reminder of the life he might still build if he allowed himself to step beyond the edges of his solitude. When the last of the sunlight slipped behind the ridge, he rose slowly. His joints felt the long day, yet his steps carried a steadiness he had not felt in years. Inside the cabin, the shadows draped across the walls like long-forgotten curtains. He walked to the corner, where his old rifle leaned against the boards. The metal caught the faint glow from the hearth and reflected it in a muted shimmer. He lifted the rifle with care, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palm. This was the same weapon he had held in moments of regret, moments when he believed he had failed to protect someone who needed him. Now he raised it, not as a shield, but as an offering to memory. He placed it back on the wall, letting it rest in the place where it belonged. The rifle no longer represented guilt. It had become a reminder of the choice he made that morning when he refused to let another injustice pass unchallenged. Near the hearth lay the carved stone given to him by the elder, a simple shape, a pattern etched into its surface with quiet intention. He lifted it between his fingers and felt the warmth the fire had left upon it. The elder had placed this stone in his hand with a look that held thanks and understanding. It was not a reward. It was a marker, a symbol of a path chosen with courage rather than fear. He set the stone on the flat surface beside the hearth where the firelight could touch it. The soft glow clung to its carved lines, turning it into a small beacon of quiet promise. He stepped back and let his gaze rest on it. The cabin felt different now. The walls held a sense of peace rather than loneliness. The air felt lighter, shaped by the truth he had defended. The stone remained still in the firelight. A final image, a reminder that choosing justice, even once, could reshape the course of a man's life and guide him toward a future he had not dared to imagine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Old Western Tales for more frontier stories. And don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments.